Okay, let's talk about a subject that should be near and dear to our hearts, the creation of the United States, how we are expressing nationalism, and also that we're becoming more democratic. Okay. The United States during this time period was very much involved with moving westward. This is called our period of manifest destiny. We are preordained to occupy the entire continent. So we are expanding westward. Here are a few of the purchases that we made in this time period. Louisiana Purchase, which basically doubled the size of the country. The purchase of Florida and Oregon in 1818. The largest territory of land that we ever received at one time, the Mexican cession at the end of the Mexican War. We purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, and we annexed Hawaii in 1898 in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. So you can see that we're progressively moving westward. We're also expanding democracy as we go westward. We were the country that had the most men that could vote in any place in the world. By the 1830s, almost all white men could vote. So it was one of the most liberal systems in the world. But there were a couple of things that were at work to try to make things a little bit more equitable in this country. One of these is the abolitionist movement, the move to end slavery. So that's a very, very strong motivating thing in the time right before the American Civil War. Two people that you should be familiar with are William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Both of them were leading abolitionists. Garrison was white. Douglass was an escaped slave. And of course, be familiar with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which did a lot to humanize slaves. This was also the time where the women's suffrage movement gets off the ground. They met at Seneca Falls in 1848 and drafted a Declaration of Independence, which models itself after the original Declaration of Independence, except that it says that all men and women are created equal. This was very slow, though, to be accepted by many Americans. It's not going to be till the latter part of the 19th century that women actually are going to receive the right to vote. The big traumatic event of this time period is the Civil War. The Civil War started for a lot of reasons. You could say, for instance, there was this regionalism and sectionalism between North and South. The economies in these places were different. The North tended to be more industrial, the South agricultural, but by far the most important thing that pushed the United States into this conflict was slavery. It would not have happened if it wasn't for slavery. So we killed more Americans doing this than all the other wars combined. Over 600,000 Americans died, close to 1 million casualties. That's people who were killed and who were wounded. This, of course, was put into play by Abraham Lincoln being elected in 1860. The Republican Party stood for restricting slavery to where it currently existed. And this, of course, is what pushed the slave states in the South to secede and create the Confederacy. So if it wasn't for the Republican Party stance, this would not have happened, okay? One of the things that Lincoln does begin to push as the war progresses is the idea of ending slavery. So in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in rebel territory, was issued. And then in the aftermath of the Civil War, there were a couple of amendments that were added to the Constitution that did deal with slaves or former slaves. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment recognized that Africans that were born here were U.S. citizens. And the 15th Amendment recognizes that all males that are citizens have the right to vote. So, these are three very important amendments, particularly the 14th, which has an equal and I'm recording this and I can't even think of it, but it has basically the 14th Amendment says that rights that are granted to some citizens also need to be granted to others. Equal protections clause. I just remembered it. Okay. After the Civil War, all the gains that were made with freedmen for a brief period of time were ended when white Southern governments that weren't Republican took back over. They placed segregation in place in Southern states, and It's not going to be till the 1950s that really these things are going to be challenged and pushed away. This is the time period of tremendous economic growth in the United States. We already were in the process of industrializing before the Civil War. After the Civil War, we take off. Largely, this is because we have lots of resources. We do have a stable government. Our population was increasing rapidly, not only through natural increase, but also through immigration. So we had a lot of labor. We definitely embraced the free enterprise system, and property rights have always been very important to Americans, maybe sometimes even above more personal things, but property has always been respected. This is the time period of corporation growth. We talked about this with the Industrial Revolution. You have huge businesses that basically become monopolies. So you have this large amount of wealth that's going to just a few people's hands. Most Americans were still poor. And you do see a lot of effort into changing things by labor unions being created, by calling attention to some of the problems. In fact, there are two movements in the United States that work to address problems, to try to reform. They were the populists and the progressives. Populists were in the 1890s, progressives were in the early 1900s. But you can see some of the things they were working towards: 8-hour workdays, child labor laws, antitrust legislation to break up these corporations, putting in place secret ballots, primary elections so that voters could decide who the candidates are going to be for political office. And ultimately, their big success was the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. So that concludes our notes for the United States.